Today, I want to talk about what makes adventures fun. The medium we're operating in is so defined by its interactivity, and the most common description you'll hear about role playing games writ large is that you could feasibly do whatever it is you might want to do. So, with that in mind, if that's the selling point of the games and of the medium at large, there's, I think, a necessity of emphasizing agency and choice in kind of every level of play, right? I think it's pretty common for people to be very excited about character options, kind of tinkering and building around um, certain ideas or fantasies, and also kind of like exciting abilities. That's a pretty big selling point for a lot of like RPGs. Um, think of things like Pathfinder, D&D Fourth Edition. Um, wish I had more options, more examples. But there's also something. There's this other kind of discourse that's paired with that uh, that I don't see necessarily brought up as a correlated problem, and that's of like linear gameplay and railroads, right? Now, the distinction between sandbox and linear play and what a railroad really is, that's been talked to death, and I'm not really here to kind of rehash that argument. But what I do think is worth thinking about and discussing today is how we can emphasize good and interesting agency in adventure design, because it's something that I think goes a little unsung when we talk about kind of linear role playing and linear like adventures. There's not really, from my experience, a ton of conversation about how you go about rectifying that. There's some pretty common ideas, right? Allow the players to interact with the world and change things as they see fit. But there's, from a design perspective, not a lot of advice on how to do it. There's some iconic speakers out there, um, but there aren't. It's not like super straightforward, if that makes sense. And so, for me, kind of where I'm at with making this game, I want to sit down and write a series of adventures that people can have as part of the Rat Quest um, product. I wanted to make sure that I was adhering to that kind of design idea, and I thought it would be useful, both from a personal record and for maybe a professional record, to demonstrate what I'm doing to make sure that that kind of idea is ironclad in the design process. Kind of an unsung hero in what makes adventures fun is the core conceit or the premise. It's a really important idea, and it's a little tricky to do. It's fairly common in my experience, and I'm sure across the board, that you will throw out as a game master a series of ideas or storylines or little situations the players might pick up on, and they have the power to just be like, no, we're not interested. And that's sometimes a little, it stings a little, but that's what makes it kind of tricky. What is exciting to you may not be exciting to them. And the good rule of thumb, in my experience, is knowing what works for them. And there are a few kind of easy tricks that you can do to kind of rope the players in. Um, the most obvious way is to sort of tie it back into them. Say the players are standing before some job board in some frontier town, and they're looking at a series of like protect and escort, go to a mine, and then they see one that's like that guy that pissed you off a couple weeks ago. He's back and he's got a band of bandits out in the forest. I would say it's most likely that they are more interested in pursuing that lead than anything else. So that's a pretty easy way to get people kind of on board, right? You want to just like have it be a personal investment. But I think something that's a little bit harder to do and really relies on both like how you sell it and also appealing to what the players are looking for when they have a ton of this agency and choice is kind of like what makes for a dramatic premise. Um, there's again a kind of like easy rule of thumb, like if you make it sufficiently, large, they're going to be interested. For example, if you were to set up like they live on some kind of beach town and there's a volcano in the distance that's being angered by some, fire elementals or whatever. Uh, and if the players don't do something, then the whole town is going to be washed away. That's enough of a dramatic premise that I think they will be sufficiently motivated to go check it out. It's the middle ground that I think makes it a little bit harder. And there is a kind of a strangeness to it and an artistry that I don't know if I've fully figured out. But it's weird, that kind of sweet spot of like something's interesting and engaging and um, worth looking into, but isn't something that will absolutely crumble or erode the world as the players know it. Um, if they don't go and pursue it, right? Because that's where you fall into a little bit more of like a do this or something bad is going to happen. And if you want to emphasize player agency, that's not really the direction you want to go in. Although it's fine in like something more linear, right? Like that's fine. Um, and sometimes it's necessary to have those kinds of stakes, but we'll get into that later. What's interesting for me is how this is something I've observed, and I don't know if there's a better word for it, but what I like to call it is sort of an alteration or expansion to the world as the characters know it. That's that kind of middle ground that I want to talk about. Um, there's advice by people like Sly Flourish who talk about kind of factions, and a great way to run games, in my experience, is to have um, NPCs acting kind of in the background, and ways in which you can make um, interesting not sure what the plural um, is allow those moments to kind of expand laterally or horizontally. What I mean by that is, um, say for example, let's combine those two situations. They're looking at a job board on a beach down. There's a volcano in the distance. There may be fire elementals who are stirring up the thing. It isn't quite clear what the fire elementals are doing. There's that bandit situation. Those are the two kind of things that the players are aware of. There's this third option where there's some mystery out in some ruined, crumbling manor. And it doesn't initially seem like it's connected to these two things, but once the players go and investigate, they find out that maybe the fire elementals in this bandit situation, they both are being coordinated by some evil wizard or whatever, right? And the players would only find that out if they had gone and pursued this mystery. Um, and I think that's the sweet spot that I think really makes something work, where it's just something a little random, and it's just something a little, disconnected. And I think sometimes when you're sitting down and running games, you'll get caught up in this idea of like, well, the story has to go in this direction, and the players have to uncover these facts. But when you throw something disconnected in, sometimes the players rejoice in that and they're like, well, we want to go and pursue that. And the fun of it is for you, I think, trying to either organize those ideas back into the world, or into the story that the players can uncover mysteries throughout, um, or by allowing that to become like a seed for later. George R. R. Martin is kind of famously called a gardener. There are other ideas about like just throwing random bullshit out and being like, maybe this will come back. And that kind of leads back into what I think is um, kind of the second way, or like the sort of like important meat of the fun adventure design, and that's sort of the dynamism of player agency. When you have random stuff that just goes off horizontally, it allows you to then later on harvest that for really engaging um, bu- 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 new content or new storylines, or to make it feel more interconnected, and things like that. And that only happens as a result of the players pursuing something that you maybe didn't necessarily think was all that important. Um, I'm talking loosely about sandbox play here, obviously, but I think that there's lessons to be learned here in what makes something when you're sitting down to write an adventure for some kind of product. Um, there's lessons there that you can take and invest back in your structure to make it more robust and holistic and fun, right? So that's the big question then. How do you make those choices dynamic and how do you make them meaningful? There's again a series of core ideas that I think are useful to remember. Um, an easy one is sort of some kind of dilemma, ethical or maybe not necessarily moral, but some power, some power that the characters have to interface with the world and in turn work their agency across it. Um, Obviously, the easiest way to make a choice meaningful and probably memorable is to have a big sweeping moral moment where the players can either interfere and be heroes, or if they're making a choice between two bad options, that's a pretty can be a pretty harrowing moment and can be a pretty distinct and defining moment for a adventure or whatever. Um, Something that's a little less like emotive but is still interesting is when you are dealing with when the players are empowered to be in a position to raise up rival factions. I think this is one of those ones where like something can happen as a result of their choices that can then pay out later. I'm trying to think of a good example. Let's go back to this bandit guy. Say the bandit guy has two he's building up a bandit clan, right? But there's a series of bandit groups in the forest, and he is courting two of them at the same time. They hate each other. The players, because they hate this first bandit guy, the Bandit King or whatever, uh, can go to both of these rival groups and either sway them against each other or against the Bandit King. And then they could either become allies or adversaries based on the player's choices. Uh, and I think that's kind of an interesting one idea. It may not have like a ton of like ethical or real like big serious questions that the players have to ask, but it's a solid enough structure that the players will be engaged, and then you can then as a game master go back and be like, okay, let's make this a little bit more interesting and fun, especially if you give them sort of iconic ideas or names or sort of like behaviors, having them join in with the evil faction or with the players, be some sort of like scrupulous ally. That's fun, right? That's kind of the purpose of the game. Um, this is the core idea here, right? With all of the ways in which you make the choices dynamic, um, is kind of letting them go, right? There's an adage that says, or an aphorism, prep situations, not plots. You want to engineer little moments, a back alley brawl, an altercation between two market stall vendors, um, bandits and werewolves fighting in the forest that the players can come across and then interact with and have the world breathe and expand and go on from there. The most important thing I think that it comes to with dynamic choices to remember, the most important thing to remember with dynamic choices is that they have to have interesting and engaging consequences. First and foremost, I think the for the world to make sense and for the choice to matter, those choices have to happen and then rest and breathe, and then you can come back to them. I don't know if what I'm trying to say is that the idea here is that you always have to let things go um, before they return, but I think it's a really useful way in which that you can allow your imagination and your ideas to return to you naturally. So if I had to summarize, I think what I'm trying to get at is that to make a choice dynamic, make a weird situation that the players have some opportunity to engage with interestingly, have it happen, and then let it go for, like, maybe a week or so, and then maybe there's a way for them to come back. I think that'll just get the juices going, um, and allow you to, I don't know, uh, experiment with it. And with sort of writing and drafting adventure structures, uh, it's useful to have those kinds of like flowchart style if then statements, at least when it comes to the design perspective. Um, Say for example they're choosing between those two factions to say to either join with the Bandit King or join with them. Um, if I were sitting down to write that adventure out, I would have that encounter happen and then have like just two little boxes, right? That says if the players court these people, they go here and they show up later in this chapter and this other encounter to either assist, or if they fail to court them, work against the players, and that can make other things harder later or easier. Or maybe these other bandits can just leave. That's an interesting choice in and of itself. They just are no longer a part of the problem. That's all fun, right? That's what's interesting. Um, so the player's ability to work their kind of will on outside action, that's the point, right? The last core kind of idea of like what makes an adventure fun is stakes, threats, consequence. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about the premise, but I think something that comes up in these games quite a bit is that often players will just want to engage with what the core loop of the game is. Um, if that's fighting things like monsters or bandits or whatever, sometimes they just want a good fight. If it's about talking and intrigue and roleplay, sometimes the challenge is just setting up a big mystery for them to engage with and sink their teeth in. This one's a little bit strange because it isn't necessarily about like sort of dynamic behavior, but it is about kind of selling the product at large. Uh, Nobody really likes a cakewalk. Maybe the first couple times, but not all the time. Sometimes things get boring, so keeping the players on their toes. I think the best way to sort of establish threats, again kind of like the premise where you want to connect them back to the players. Maybe you want to. There's an interesting distinction here between what makes a person a good threat and what makes an obstacle a good threat. In Rat Quest, there's not really a meaningful distinction between the two, at least from a design perspective. Like, other rats, other rat NPCs are obstacles just as much as like, you know, a big step or a little fences. Um, but what makes those two different is that, and not really, because you can foreshadow both of them, but I think shrouding something in myth is easier when it comes to an object. Not always. Like there's an interesting with people you can have a person that they interact with and taunt and kind of like come back to rival with. That's always fun. Or you can have a for very like looming sort of faceless threat that the players eventually interact with. Both of those are pretty cool ideas for how you might interact with a villain. With an obstacle like a dangerous cliff or a flooding river valley, setting up these challenges ahead of time, making the players aware of them, building up their ideas and their stories so that the players both expect the challenge and also are excited by it. These are more sort of like in the moment ideas of how the adventure structure operates, and it's less so on the design perspective. I think it's more of a game master tip than it is anything else. Um, but it's important, right? You don't want to have something just come out of nowhere and jump the players. Um, the other part about this is it's kind of a two to tango moment. When you have a good threat that's like foreshadowed and exciting and the players expect the challenge. If that thing ends up being easy, that's fine, but it can't always be that way. Otherwise, the players won't take the world seriously. You want to deliver, set up and deliver the idea and the reality of the thing. So those last two things, threats and consequence, challenge and conclusion, they're not really design problems necessarily. They're execution, but it's still meaningful to remember when I'm sitting down to write adventure ideas because it is necessary to when you're drafting something like this, when you're sitting down to write a full adventure product that someone else will pick up and run, I think that kind of information is useful to know. For example, if you're, back in town, the Bandit King is recruiting people, yada, yada, yada. If the players can learn about the different factions that the Bandit King is recruiting and then go and face them and then maybe fight them or ally with them, those are things that you might include as snippets of information or blocks of text when they're in the town section of the adventure so that they feel like the world is fully alive and exciting and realized. All of those things together are kind of what I'm keeping in mind when I'm sitting down to write RadQuest Adventures. I do want this product to be a fully realized single page or however many pages for players and then a bunch of stuff for game masters. So RadQuest, as little as the game is, right, it's pretty small. um, People can pick it up and be like, this is a full thing that I can do and play. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. Those are my ideas. Let me know what you think. Do you think I missed anything really obvious? I hope not, but I might have. Anyway, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.